Emily Riker had lived alone on the edge of Avery Township for over 12 years, in a two-story cedar frame house, perched just far enough from the main road to feel disconnected from everything she didn't want to deal with. The gravel path that curled up to her property had no streetlights, no pavement, and no clear markers, but it was hers. It wasn't shared, and it wasn't regulated. The deed stated plainly that the driveway and the half-mile stretch of land it cut through was private, registered and taxed as part of her parcel. She'd inherited it from her late husband, who'd bought the land as a kind of retreat before his passing, a quiet patch of earth where no one could knock unless they meant to. Emily had maintained it not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. In a world that felt increasingly crowded, she had space. Real space. With trees that arched like sentinels overhead, and silence so complete she could hear deer stepping through the underbrush before she saw them. She wasn't naive. She knew what people thought of private roads and secluded living, how it drew suspicion, how the nearby neighborhood associations didn't like outliers, especially when their own developments kept expanding year by year, tightening around her like a slow coil. She didn't go to meetings. She didn't participate in bake sales or zoning committees. She paid her taxes, maintained her boundaries, and didn't interfere with anyone. In her eyes, that was enough. But recently, she'd started to notice a shift. Not overt at first, just subtle signals that someone was testing limits. It began with the mail. Letters started arriving in envelopes stamped with unfamiliar logos, marked community outreach or shared improvement notices. Inside were vague announcements about neighborhood initiatives, road assessments, regional beautification grants. None of them were directly addressed to her, but they always mentioned her road. The tone was always polite but presumptive, like someone trying to establish something that hadn't been agreed upon. She ignored them, as she had ignored the rest, but the first real intrusion came in the form of sound. Late one night, lying in bed with a book resting on her chest, Emily heard a sharp metallic clink, followed by a short scraping noise. It came from down the hill, somewhere along the drive, and it wasn't natural. Not wind, not branches. It was man-made. She rose quietly, slipped on a flannel shirt, and moved to the upstairs window, but the trees swallowed most of her view. The motion sensor floodlights at the midpoint of the road didn't trigger, and for a moment she considered letting it go. But that unease, that specific weight in her stomach, told her otherwise. She grabbed a flashlight, stepped into the night barefoot but deliberate, and began walking down the drive. The gravel crunched beneath her heels, the flashlight beam dancing against the dark like a whip. When she reached the bend near the old mailbox, she saw it. 2 narrow strips of metal bolted directly into the gravel. Industrial-looking, matte black, and lined with sharp upward-facing teeth. At first she thought they were caltrops, but they were too neat, too calculated. These were tire spikes. Not something dropped carelessly, but something designed and installed. Deliberate. She crouched slowly, running her fingers just above the steel. Cold, smooth, unmoving. They were embedded deep, maybe 6 bolts on each side and freshly drilled. Whoever placed them had done it quietly, surgically, and quickly. There were no tire tracks near them, just footprints in the dirt that led back to the tree line on the far side. Emily didn't take pictures, didn't scream. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes in silence, the air thick with pine and moisture, her mind running through scenarios like a quiet engine. Vandalism? No, too technical. A prank? No one she knew had the precision or audacity. A mistake? Highly unlikely. She didn't recognize the equipment, but she recognized the message. Someone was trying to establish control. The next morning, she removed them. Not angrily, not with reckless destruction, but methodically. She fetched her tools wearing gloves and spent nearly an hour unbolting them, one spike at a time. Beneath each plate, she found a thin adhesive strip and small metallic nodes embedded in the bolts. Sensors, maybe. Or RFID triggers. She didn't know for sure, but she labeled them, wrapped them in canvas, and stored them in the back of her garage. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived. It was folded in thirds inside a manila envelope, printed on heavy stock paper with an embossed seal that simply read, Residential Infrastructure Committee. She didn't recall consenting to anything like that. Inside was a notification of temporary road modifications to improve vehicle speed regulation and environmental harmony in transition areas. Her private driveway had apparently been classified as a shared access route for emergency spillover. Purposes during a regional safety study. No prior notice, no consent. The letter had a barcode in the corner and a vague threat at the bottom. Tampering with installed infrastructure may result in administrative fines or civil review. Emily sat at her kitchen table for almost an hour, rereading the sentence, the phrasing circling like a drone in her head. Civil review. As though her land, her road, had been quietly reclassified, not through law or formal notice, but through language and initiative. She called the number at the bottom of the letter, but no one answered. Just a recorded message thanking her for her interest and asking her to leave a callback number. She didn't. Instead, she contacted the county recorder's office, gave them her parcel ID, and asked for any updated documentation that might reflect new zoning. The clerk on the line told her nothing had changed. "You still own it in full," she said. "No easements, no new filings? Nothing from the county, at least." Emily hung up and exhaled slowly. That should have brought relief, but it didn't. 2 days later, the spikes were back. This time, they were different. Heavier, welded, more secure. A yellow warning placard had been planted 6 feet ahead of them, staked into the earth with a simple message. Controlled speed zone. Do not remove. That morning, Emily received another letter. Not mailed, but hand-delivered, folded beneath the wiper blade of her truck. It was shorter, terser, unsigned. Your non-cooperation creates liability for the greater neighborhood. We ask for your participation moving forward. The handwriting was neat, all uppercase, deliberate in the way cult leaders and cold bureaucrats write when trying to seem neutral. Emily didn't panic. She didn't cry. She did what she always did. She documented. She photographed the spikes, the new placard, the note. She began a folder, both physical and digital. She started a paper trail, and then, quietly, she reached out to someone she hadn't called in nearly 5 years. Her old friend Marissa, now working at a land surveying agency. Not because Marissa could fix it, but because she could help Emily see what the paper didn't say, the boundaries, the loopholes, the tactics. Because Emily was starting to understand that this wasn't just about road control. It was about leverage, about pressure. Someone was trying to establish a legal presence on her land without ever going through the front door. And if she didn't act quickly and carefully, they might succeed. The following week brought a subtle but steady increase in tension, the kind that didn't explode but seeped in quietly like water through an unseen crack. Emily kept to her routine. Early mornings spent tending to the property, late afternoons balancing freelance orders from her old client list, and quiet evenings reading on the porch. But there was an edge now to every motion, a sense that something intangible had shifted and would not reset. The spike strips were gone, removed by the same methodical hands that had installed them, likely under the cover of darkness, and now in their place were shallow bolt scars and a layer of gravel that seemed slightly more leveled than before, like someone had tried to erase all evidence but didn't quite care enough to do it properly. Then came the official envelope. It arrived not by mail but courier, left at her gate inside a weatherproof sleeve, clipped to the wooden post she'd hammered in years ago to display her parcel number. The paper was thick, government style with a generic header, but what caught her attention was the language. Notice of administrative integration, followed by a dense paragraph citing municipal ordinance adjustments, transition oversight clauses, and a reference to a so-called special land use coordination protocol. Emily read the first paragraph 5 times before realizing that the essence of the letter boiled down to one thing: a reclassification of a portion of her property, specifically the driveway, under an urban spillover agreement, effective pending. Approval, which the document declared in passing, had already been granted via proxy consent. The term sounded made up like something pulled from a bureaucratic thesaurus, but the intent was unmistakable. Her road was no longer just hers, not on paper, not in practical terms. Attached was a map, dated 6 months prior, showing a revised zoning layout for the northern edge of Avery Township. Her lot was marked in pale gray, but a dashed red line now traced the entire length of her driveway, branching outward like an artery to connect with an adjacent development labeled Phase 3 Residential Buffer Corridor. It looked clinical, calculated, and fully integrated into the broader design. There was no mention of compensation, no invitation to appeal, No contact person listed beyond a general legal address in a different county. Emily didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Instead, she poured a second cup of coffee, sat on her porch with the papers spread out on the table, and started underlining key phrases with a red pen. She called Marissa the next morning. They met at a neutral spot, a local cafe on the edge of town, both women careful not to speak too loudly. Marissa brought her laptop and a small scanner, and Emily handed over the documents without saying much. Marissa barely blinked as she read, but her jaw tightened incrementally with each paragraph. "This isn't zoning," she said after a long pause. "This is jurisdictional manipulation. They're trying to justify access by embedding your road into an environmental development clause. It's legal in theory, but only if your property meets the criteria, which it doesn't." She pulled up a list of regulations on her screen, tapping through layers of planning commission updates. "They're using your road to support overflow infrastructure for the development down the hill. Probably couldn't get direct access approved, so they invented a workaround." Emily felt a cold ripple move through her chest. Can they do that? Marissa hesitated, then exhaled through her nose. "They can try. If no one pushes back, it becomes precedent. That's how these things work." She paused again. "They're banking on you doing nothing." But Emily wasn't the type to do nothing. Within 24 hours, she retained legal counsel. Not someone flashy, but a veteran attorney named Conrad Ellis, known for property disputes and municipal accountability cases. She handed over everything: the letters, the map, the photos, the removal timeline. Ellis listened carefully, asking pointed but calm questions. "Did anyone approach you in person before this happened?" he asked at one point. "No one with a badge," Emily replied. "Just a woman a few months ago. She stopped by saying she was collecting information on shared-use pathways. I assumed it was for the trail extension project. She didn't ask to come up the drive." Ellis tapped his pen against a notepad. "They'll probably argue implied consent. Any interaction, any acknowledgement, they'll try to use it." He sat back. "But here's the thing. They've overreached. That red line on the map? That's not backed by anything enforceable unless they had either a recorded easement or a land use variance approved by council with notice to adjacent property owners. There's no evidence they served you with that." Emily felt a small current of relief, but it was short-lived. Ellis folded the papers into a thick manila folder. "We'll need to file an immediate motion to freeze any changes. If they install anything else, or if someone enters your land under the pretense of this notice, document everything. No confrontations, no removals. Let me do the talking." She nodded, her instincts aligning with his caution. Still, the next morning, she found a new marker at the bottom of the hill. A metal post with a barcode and a solar-powered reader attached to its base. A laminated card was zip-tied to the top. "Access monitoring system, temporary." The barcode didn't scan on her phone and no company name was listed. That afternoon, 3 men in reflective vests parked near the road's entrance. They didn't come up the drive, but they stood beside the post, pointing, measuring, and jotting things down. One of them took a photo of her gate. None of them looked toward her house, but Emily could feel the intentional disregard in their body language. They were staking out territory that didn't belong to them. She reported it to Ellis, who immediately filed for a temporary restraining order against unauthorized access, citing invasion of private property and potential tampering. 2 days later, a response came, not from the county, but from a private law firm representing what they referred to as the Community Council. The letter was formal, defensive, and full of evasive language. They claimed their client had been empowered to coordinate infrastructure improvements that may include passive use of non-permanent assets located within shared corridors adjacent to residential developments. The phrase made Emily's skin crawl. Non-permanent assets. That was how they were describing her driveway. And apparently the post with the scanner didn't qualify as a permanent structure, which meant it didn't require a permit. Yet, at Ellis's request, Emily began logging every unusual activity near the drive, keeping a detailed written record. No speculation, just facts. License plates, time of day, interactions, photos when appropriate. She set up a motion sensor trail camera, not hidden, not aggressive, just positioned at tree level facing the lower bend of the road, angled toward the area where the new activity clustered. Within 3 days, she had images of 2 different vehicles, neither registered to any of her immediate neighbors, parked briefly near the post and then leaving. None of it proved intent, but it proved pattern. That weekend, as a soft drizzle fell through the pines, she received one more envelope. It wasn't delivered by hand or mail. It was left under her doormat, folded in half and sealed with a plain white sticker. Inside was a single piece of paper with typed text in the center. No header, no contact. Just one line. Your resistance is being documented. Emily didn't show fear. She showed it to Ellis. He scanned it, raised an eyebrow, and simply said, "Good. So are we." By the end of the following week, Emily's property had gone from quiet retreat to something resembling a slow-rolling siege. It didn't happen with explosions or overt hostility. It unfolded through paperwork, equipment installations that came and went under cover of early morning fog, and the kind of deliberate ambiguity that bureaucrats and developers weaponized when trying to make someone feel like the intruder on their own land. Despite the restraining order that Conrad had filed, Emily began to see an uptick in what the council's legal team now called survey support activity. That phrase appeared multiple times in their most recent response, a dense 14-page brief, littered with passive voice and conditional verbs. It claimed that no member of the council or its affiliates had physically trespassed, and any instruments placed along the road were temporary data collection devices required to fulfill contractual obligations tied to municipal infrastructure, grants. The kicker came in the final paragraph, which stated that Emily's attempts to interfere with or dismantle said devices would be documented as acts of obstruction. Emily wasn't interested in dismantling anything. She wanted it gone, legally, thoroughly, and without escalation, but that preference was becoming less and less tenable with each passing day. That Monday, a new device appeared near the bend at the bottom of the drive. It looked like a traffic counter at first, a flat black sensor strip stretched across the width of the gravel path, anchored with metal brackets on either side. Emily walked down to inspect it, her boots crunching along the familiar stone. She crouched beside the strip, brushed a few pine needles away, and discovered 2 things. First, the strip was attached to a reinforced cable that disappeared into a plastic housing unit labeled DVTI-143, which sat discreetly behind a camouflage, tarp staked into the embankment. Second, the brackets anchoring the strip were drilled directly into the drive, and one of them had cracked the top layer of the culvert pipe running beneath the gravel. That damage, though minor, was now a legal liability. Her liability. She photographed the site, took notes, and walked back up the hill, her pulse steady but her jaw tight. That afternoon she called Conrad. He listened without interruption, then asked her to send the pictures. Within an hour he had filed an emergency motion citing physical intrusion and structural compromise. This wasn't just legal overreach anymore, it was material sabotage. The hearing was set for the following Friday. In the meantime, Conrad advised her to avoid direct confrontation and, under no circumstances, to touch the equipment. Emily followed his instructions, but it felt more like tolerating a presence than upholding the law. On Wednesday, she received an unmarked package left on her porch in plain sight. No return address. Inside were 3 laminated documents, a reprint of the jurisdictional integration notice, the municipal code clause referencing shared transit corridors, and a map almost identical to the one she'd received weeks earlier. Only this time, her parcel was highlighted in yellow and labeled Stage 2 Implementation Zone. A sticky note was attached with a handwritten message in black ink. Please remain cooperative. Further resistance may impact eligibility for adjacent infrastructure improvements. The handwriting was clean, round, and deliberately spaced, professional but anonymous. Emily scanned the note, logged the delivery, then burned the sticky note in a coffee tin on her back porch. That night, the sensor strip triggered unexpectedly around 2:30 a.m., emitting a short chirping alarm that echoed up the drive like a bird call warped by metal. Emily sat upright in bed, heart hammering, and listened. The sound lasted less than 10 seconds, followed by silence. She stayed awake the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind drawing hard lines between what she knew and what she could prove. By morning, she had a plan. Not to fight back, but to reinforce her boundaries legally and physically. First, she scheduled a property survey, an official notarized reassessment that would document every inch of her road, from the mailbox to the foundation of her home. Marissa's firm sent a team that Friday, 2 men in utility vests and 1 in a collared shirt who explained that they'd be marking GPS points, checking elevation lines, and inspecting for any signs of encroachment creep. Emily walked the drive with them, silent for the most part, pointing only when asked. They were professional, efficient, and clearly experienced in navigating murky property disputes. One of the surveyors noted that the far end of her drive had unusually fresh gravel, lighter in tone, more angular, suggesting recent activity or surface treatment. Emily hadn't ordered gravel in over a year. As they worked, a silver SUV rolled up to the edge of the tree line, parked for a moment, then slowly reversed and disappeared. The driver never stepped out. One of the surveyors raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Emily noted the time, the make of the vehicle, and the partial plate. By Monday, the initial report was ready, confirming that the drive had no recorded easements and no shared access declarations. It was private land, period. Conrad added the document to their case file and sent copies to both the county and the council's legal team with a formal cease and desist demand. 2 days later, Emily received her first citation. It was printed on glossy cardstock, delivered via courier, and titled, Notice of Violation, Obstruction of Monitoring Equipment. It cited a section of code she'd never heard of, claimed she had interfered with ongoing municipal data gathering, and warned of escalating penalties, including provisional access recalibration and property use reassessment. The language was carefully constructed to sound like official government action, but the bottom of the document listed no government office, only a post office box and a reference number tied to Community Oversight Division, which, as far as Emily could determine, did not exist outside of the council's internal nomenclature. Emily brought the citation to Conrad. He read it twice, then chuckled without humor. "They're trying to create a record," he said. "If they issue enough of these, they'll argue that you're non-compliant, and that non-compliance warrants further intervention. It's the long game. Manufactured consent through layered paper trails." That same afternoon, as she was walking her property line, Emily discovered a new sign staked into the earth near the southern edge of her lot. It was rectangular, metal, and mounted on a steel pole, clearly designed to withstand weather. The sign read, Project Site, Environmental Monitoring in Progress. Unauthorized access prohibited. Below the text was a QR code, but scanning it led to a blank web page. The land on which the sign stood was hers, confirmed by both survey and deed. Yet the presence of the sign suggested otherwise. She documented it, reported it, and waited. That night, she heard the sensor alarm again. Shorter this time, almost muted like a warning sigh. The tension came to a head the following weekend when a small team of workers arrived in the early morning hours. 3 men in dark coveralls stepped out of a marked van, unloaded equipment, and began walking the lower edge of her drive. Emily observed from the porch, camera in hand, documenting each movement. When she stepped closer, one of the men waved her off, stating they were there for low-impact calibration under existing transition protocols. She responded by reading from the cease and desist order filed by Conrad. The men ignored her. She called the sheriff's office. By the time a deputy arrived 40 minutes later, the men had packed up and left, but not before installing 2 small dome-shaped devices on either side of the drive. Low to the ground, discreet, and blinking red. The deputy took her statement, examined the devices, and shrugged. "I'm not sure what they are," he said. "They're not marked as explosives or surveillance. Could be motion detectors. You'll need a formal order to remove them if they're not clearly illegal." Emily thanked him, then walked back to the porch with a growing sense of calculated helplessness. Every move she made was within her rights. Every move they made was designed to blur the line. It wasn't an invasion, it was erosion. Not a break-in, but a slow, relentless drafting of new borders over land that already had lines. And yet, even as the pressure mounted, Emily didn't falter. Her patience wasn't weakness, it was preparation. They were escalating, so would she. But on her terms. Through the system they thought they'd mastered. Not with rage or retaliation, with precision, paper, and presence. They wanted to turn her road into a corridor. She would turn their corridor into evidence. It wasn't until the environmental monitor nearest the mailbox began emitting an irregular beeping sound, short, staccato chirps like an ECG monitor in distress, that Emily understood this was no longer about one road or one property line. That sound, as benign as it might have seemed to an outsider, confirmed something that she and Conrad had been suspecting for days. These devices were not merely collecting environmental data. They were either performing functions no one had authorized or acting as placeholders for something more permanent. What had begun as an ambiguous administrative boundary dispute was now expanding into physical intrusion, functional interference, and reputational warfare. And yet, no one had stepped forward as the single responsible party. By the time the third dome was installed, this one in the dense pine scrub along the northeastern edge of her property, Emily knew she needed a broader lens. Conrad, to his credit, had already anticipated this. That same week, he introduced her to a forensic consultant he'd worked with in a past dispute involving unauthorized utility installations. The consultant's name was David Perch, a calm, sharply observant man with a background in telecom infrastructure and data systems. He wasn't dressed like someone who dealt with land boundaries, jeans, a worn canvas jacket, no clipboard, but he asked precise questions, listened more than he spoke, and documented everything with a compact handheld scanner. Emily walked him down the drive, pointing out each device, each sign, each remnant of interaction. And Perch nodded silently, occasionally muttering to himself as he adjusted his scanner. When they returned to the house, he spread out a tablet and showed her a heat map he'd generated using signal strength. The three devices were not just measuring air quality or seismic vibration. They were communicating wirelessly on a private mesh network. That network, he explained, wasn't broadcasting over standard consumer frequencies, but rather hopping through encrypted short bursts across spread spectrum intervals. In plain terms, they were talking to each other, possibly relaying data to a central node that hadn't yet been installed or was being moved frequently. These were not passive instruments. They were dynamic, and more importantly, they were reacting to movement, possibly her own. Emily didn't ask what exactly that meant. She simply stared at the map and asked, "Can we prove this is unlawful?" Perch raised an eyebrow. "Proving it's unlawful will depend on context, but we can definitely prove it's unauthorized, undocumented, and not part of any official infrastructure listed in the open-source municipal records." Later that evening, Conrad sent an updated motion to the court, attaching Perch's preliminary yes findings. In a deliberate and measured tone, he accused the opposing counsel's client of deploying unauthorized surveillance-grade technology on private land under the guise of passive infrastructure, with the likely intention of using accumulated data to justify permanent jurisdictional expansion. The wording was sharp, dry, and devastatingly precise. Within 48 hours, the opposing firm filed a rebuttal, but notably, they did not deny the existence of the mesh network. Instead, they questioned the validity of Perch's qualifications and accused Emily of obstructing community development planning by refusing voluntary integration. That phrase, voluntary integration, became the hinge point of everything. Conrad called it the soft claw of administrative conquest. It was a term used by public-private partnerships when communities were unwilling or unable to resist infrastructural overlap. Essentially, if you didn't sign the document, but didn't formally stop the expansion, your silence became acceptance. Emily had not been silent, but they were building the illusion that she had been uncooperative without being explicit. It was the oldest trick in the bureaucratic playbook. Make the target look like the obstacle while moving quietly under the radar of any court that demanded overt violation. Still, this time, the council had moved too fast. A court date was now set for full review of property status and jurisdictional overreach. Perch agreed to testify. Emily's motion sensor camera had recorded 2 additional early morning visits. One van, one pickup, where individuals moved onto her drive without signage or identification, adjusted equipment, and left without speaking. The video timestamps showed clear entry and exit. In court, that mattered more than motive. The shift in tone came not from a dramatic confrontation, but from a simple email. It arrived in Conrad's inbox late Wednesday evening, sent from an unlisted domain and signed with only a first name, Devin. It included a PDF with redacted line items pulled from what appeared to be a private development grant application, submitted by a regional infrastructure contractor. In the document, Emily's property was listed not by name, but by parcel number, flagged as pending absorption, with a note in the margin. Coordinate placement of mesh coverage in advance of full corridor designation. Owner expected to resist. Strategy must remain within legal ambiguity. The document was not an official government file, but it was stamped by a consulting firm known for its work with public land acquisition. Whether or not it was admissible was a question for later. Its existence changed everything. That evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, the redacted PDF glowing on her laptop, the survey map spread out beside her, and felt the first real stab of clarity. Not fear, not rage, but recognition. This wasn't about her refusing cooperation. It was about her land being selected in a private meeting months ago as a tactical necessity for a larger infrastructure loop. Everything since, the letters, the citations, the monitoring domes had been part of an operational buffer to justify what had already been decided. The only reason she was still in control was because she hadn't cracked. Not yet. And that, she realized, was what they were counting on. Time. Attrition. Fatigue. They weren't trying to force her out in one move. They were trying to wear her down until she either agreed or erred in a way that made it look like she had no choice. Emily stood, stretched her back, and walked to the back door. Outside, the forest rustled softly in the wind. The domes were still there. The new sign was still up. But now, for the first time, she understood the full shape of what she was facing. Not just a neighbor dispute, not a council misunderstanding, but a slow, calculated expansion under the mask of development. They had tried to hide it in plain sight. Now she would make sure everyone else could see it too. The week that followed marked the point where the subtle shadow of pressure gave way to overt aggression. It began with an anonymous code violation notice left at the base of her mailbox, partially water-damaged but legible enough to read its core message. That Emily was now under review for non-compliance with maintenance standards within the community. Perimeter? The wording was deliberately vague, but it referenced her driveway and the presence of unapproved structural modifications within the transport-adjacent corridor. She scanned it, archived it, and passed it to Conrad, who replied within 10 minutes. They're testing a new threshold. I'll file a formal rebuttal, but this isn't about documentation anymore. It's a game of stress. Stay measured. Emily already was, but the escalation didn't pause for court filings. 2 days later, she returned home from the local supply yard to find the dome-shaped monitor units gone. But in their place were 4 low concrete bases, each about 12 inches square and embedded directly into the gravel on either side of her. Driveway's midpoint. On top of each base was a threaded steel rod, capped and waiting like unfinished scaffolding. There had been no noise, no equipment sightings, and no vehicles reported by the few neighbors she still trusted to watch from a distance. The work had been completed swiftly and precisely, likely in the window of 2 hours during which she was away. Whoever had installed the mounts had done so under the assumption that they were setting anchors, not temporary markers, and that detail that they expected to return was the part that most clearly signaled the next phase had begun. Emily took photos from every angle and sent them immediately to Conrad and to David Perch. The latter called her within the hour, voice sharp and unusually fast-paced. "Those aren't sensor mounts," he said. "They're foundation pins, exact specs for modular infrastructure, most likely camera pylons or relay towers." When she asked if they could be removed, he hesitated before answering. "Not by you, not yet. If you extract them, they'll accuse you of tampering. But if I do it as part of a structural integrity audit, that's different. I'll be there tomorrow morning." By sunrise, Perch was on site with 2 assistants and a white van marked with the logo of a structural assessment contractor. It wasn't a disguise, he did hold the credentials, but the presence of a legitimate third party added weight. Together, they documented the concrete bases, scanned their alignment, and took soil core samples. Perch confirmed what he already suspected. The mounts had been poured directly into her gravel path, atop her utility easement, without anchor shielding or any application for load certification. In plain English, they were illegal. Not in a criminal sense, perhaps, but as a violation of land use policy and engineering codes. The core samples showed accelerated drying agents, common in prefab projects designed for stealth install. "This was done fast under pressure," Perch explained. "They're trying to lock their claim physically before the legal side catches up." Emily, standing at the edge of the driveway with her arms folded, asked him what it would take to remove them without incurring retaliatory action. "We have two options," he said. "We publish this report and request a code enforcement intervention. That could take weeks, maybe months, and they'll probably counter with their own engineer." Or, he paused, then gave her a look. "I treat this as a structural safety violation and perform a site correction. But that has to be done before they return to build on it." She didn't need time to think. Do it! They worked through the afternoon. The concrete was dense but still curing, which meant it hadn't fully bonded with the sublayer. Using diamond cutters and hydraulic leverage, they extracted each base cleanly, stored the cores as evidence, and backfilled the voids with crushed stone. Perch left marker flags where each base had been, labeled with codes from his audit. The job was clean, professional, and documented in full. That evening, Emily received no visitors, no calls, no warnings. But at 3:42 a.m., her trail camera recorded a figure walking the drive, hooded, gloved, and alone. The person stopped where the bases had been, crouched, touched the flagged markers, and then disappeared back down the hill. No tools, no vandalism. Just observation. A quiet audit of their own. The next morning, 2 unmarked sedans parked just outside the tree line. No one emerged. They stayed for 15 minutes, then left. Emily watched from her kitchen window, noting the time, the license plate numbers, the brand of tires. She wasn't paranoid. She was awake. Later that day, a letter arrived. Not printed, but handwritten in a plain envelope tucked under a loose board on her porch. It read, "You have violated terms of stabilization. Actions will be reviewed. Further noncompliance may forfeit negotiation standing." The message wasn't legally binding, but it spoke to one thing clearly. Someone was losing patience. Conrad's response was to double down. He filed an injunction with the county demanding full suspension of all activity on Emily's property, pending a court ruling. He included Perch's audit, the camera footage, and the documentation of the concrete extractions. The motion was precise, irrefutable, and backed by precedent. For the first time since the beginning, the court issued a temporary freeze, not a full ruling, but a pause, long enough to slow the momentum. Still, the battle was far from over. 2 days after the court stay, a new tactic emerged. Emily's home address was submitted to the local fire department as a priority inspection candidate due to an unresolved external hazard. Within 36 hours, an inspection team arrived unannounced, citing a complaint about obstructed emergency access due to an improperly maintained roadway. Emily greeted them calmly, showed them her gravel drive, her cleared drainage paths, and the results of her latest land survey. The lead inspector, a man who looked apologetic before she even opened the door, walked the drive, took a few perfunctory notes, and finally said, "We're just responding to the ticket. Honestly, everything looks clean. But you might want to be aware, these types of reports usually come in batches." Sure enough, they did. Over the next week, Emily received notifications from the property tax assessor's office, the wildlife compliance unit, and even the agricultural pesticide review board, each citing anonymous concerns, each demanding responses. Conrad began cataloging them not as legal matters, but as a pattern. An administrative blitz designed to exhaust. They weren't winning in court, so they'd shifted to pressure by proxy, death by 1,000 forms. But Emily didn't flinch. She responded to every notice, submitted every form, attended every inspection. She took names, made logs, cross-referenced dates. Her fight was no longer about a road, it was about process. The very mechanism used against her had become the battleground, and she was holding her ground not with aggression but with discipline. They wanted chaos. She gave them bureaucracy. The final signal that they were losing came in the form of silence. For 10 days, nothing new arrived. No vehicles loitered, no devices appeared. But the quiet wasn't peace, it was anticipation. On the 11th day, Emily's motion sensor light flickered twice, then died. A small, deliberate cut in the main wire running along the lower path was found later that morning. It was clean, isolated, and intentional. Emily called Perch again. "Time to go public?" she asked. He paused on the line, then answered, "Yes," quietly, but yes. And just like that, the fight turned outward. Not just about what had been done to her, but what could be proven, what others had to see, what the courts could no longer ignore. They had escalated. She would respond with precision, not panic. And the second phase had just begun. The first court hearing under full review wasn't dramatic in the way courtroom television trained people to expect. There was no shouting, no pounding fists or theatrical speeches. But the weight in that room was unmistakable. On one side sat Emily and her legal team, Conrad, measured and calm, and David Perch, now sworn in as an expert witness with a thick binder of technical reports. On the other side sat two suited representatives from the community council's retained legal counsel, backed by a third-party observer whose name didn't appear on any official filing. Emily couldn't see his name tag clearly, but she noted the demeanor. Quiet, overconfident, and uninterested in the process unfolding around him. He wasn't there to win a case. He was there to verify the effectiveness of their system. What they hadn't expected was how thoroughly Conrad had preempted their playbook. In the days leading up to the hearing, he had compiled every citation, every violation notice, every anonymous letter, and cryptic drop-off into a single chain of intent. One by one, they were presented before the court, not as isolated nuisances, but as part of an orchestrated campaign to fabricate administrative consensus. The judge, a seasoned figure with a reputation for neutrality, didn't react with outrage or disbelief. He simply asked for clarity. Are any of these actions supported by a recorded easement, municipal code, or council ordinance recognized by this court? The opposing attorney began to answer, but the judge cut him off. With documentation, please, not interpretation. Conrad's evidence was clear. The foundational mounts had been installed without permit. The mesh network operated on frequencies unauthorized for civilian infrastructure, and the equipment itself had never been registered with any known municipal agency. Worse, the documentation presented by the other side referenced entities that either no longer existed or had been absorbed into shell organizations with dissolved accountability. The term shared use corridor, used in nearly every citation, had no legal definition in the county's code. It was, in essence, fiction, a phrase invented to imply legality where none existed. Then came the moment that tipped the scale. Perch took the stand and described, in meticulous detail, the communication behavior of the mesh devices, how they had formed a triangulated relay, how they tracked directional movement based on proximity variation, and how data from these sensors had been confirmed as offloading intermittently to a roaming signal node. He presented diagrams, signal logs, and transmission footprints, establishing that someone, somewhere, had not only authorized but continuously monitored the system. When asked if the system could be mistaken for passive environmental tracking, Perch answered plainly, no. These devices tracked individuals, not ambient conditions. They responded to specific motion signatures, not temperature or air quality. This was a behavioral monitoring network. The courtroom grew still. The opposing counsel shifted in his seat. The third man, the one Emily had noticed earlier, leaned forward slightly for the first time. That detail, human tracking, was not supposed to surface. It didn't align with any of their public documentation. They had expected to defend poor communication, perhaps even negligence. But surveillance, even passive, was a line no one wanted publicly crossed. The judge didn't render a verdict that day. He scheduled further hearings and instructed all parties to submit final briefs by the end of the week. But his closing statement to the room was clear. If what I've heard today is accurate and unrefuted, then what has occurred on Ms. Riker's property cannot be tolerated under any interpretation of law. This court does not acknowledge precedent created through manipulation. The tone wasn't just authoritative, it was pointed. It told Emily what she already knew. They were losing the narrative. The mask was slipping. Outside the courthouse, the parking lot felt heavier than the courtroom had. Emily stood by her truck, breathing in the dry autumn air. The leaves had begun to fall and the wind carried a different weight. She wasn't alone anymore. As she prepared to leave, a woman approached from across the lot. Mid-40s, neat clothes, no clipboard. She didn't introduce herself with authority or smile like an agent. She simply said, I used to live down Creekside. They did the same thing to my family 3 years ago. We moved before it reached court. I just wanted to say, It means something that you didn't. Emily didn't respond immediately. She nodded, watched the woman walk away, then sat inside her truck for a long time before starting the engine. That evening, back on her land, the atmosphere had shifted. The signs were still up, the remnants of conflict still visible, the scarred gravel, the unused posts, the fading red paint marks near the culvert. But no new devices had appeared. No vehicles had lingered on the road. There was no replacement concrete, no new notices. For the first time in weeks, the land felt still, but it wasn't peace. It was pause. That night at exactly 2:16 a.m., the motion sensor camera recorded a single figure. Hooded again, same stride, same behavior. The individual stopped at the old dome site, looked around, then did something unexpected. He placed a single sheet of paper on the ground and walked away. Emily retrieved it at dawn. It was folded once, creased cleanly, and inside was a typed message with no header or name. You were not the first, but you are the first to win this far. If you continue, you expose more than us. Are you prepared for that? The paper was unsigned. The message wasn't legal, but it wasn't a bluff either. Emily took it to Conrad. He read it twice and didn't ask where it had come from. Instead, he placed it in a file, closed the folder, and said, "That's fear. It means they're thinking defensively now. And when people like this defend, they make mistakes." He was right. 3 days later, a whistleblower from the council submitted an affidavit, anonymously through Conrad's office, confirming that the infrastructure installed on Emily's land had been part of a test program originally pitched as a public safety enhancement initiative. The council had authorized a subcontractor to perform data harvesting trials on edge parcels identified as low risk for escalation. Emily's property had been on the list. She had been flagged not for being vulnerable, but for being statistically unlikely to resist through formal channels. They had bet on her silence. She had answered with documentation, discipline, and visibility. The final hearing was set for the following month. But by then, the damage had already been done. To them. What they had built was no longer quiet. What they had denied now had form, footage, testimony. Emily wasn't just defending her land anymore. She was exposing a model, one based not on force, but on fatigue, manipulation, and silent jurisdiction. And now the silence was broken. The court's final ruling came 2 weeks after the last hearing, delivered in the form of a 46-page decision that dismantled the council's legal position with methodical precision. The judge declared the installations on Emily's property unlawful, the citations void, and the administrative tactics used by the development committee as intentionally misleading and structured to manufacture consent through confusion. He ordered immediate removal of all physical infrastructure installed under the guise of shared access, imposed financial penalties on the council's legal representatives for procedural misconduct, and recommended the initiation of a review board investigation into the broader practices of zoning manipulation in Avery Township and neighboring counties. It wasn't just a win, it was a legal rebuke that left no ambiguity about who had crossed the line. The ruling arrived on a gray Thursday morning, bound and sealed, delivered by courier. Emily read it once in silence at her kitchen table, her eyes following each paragraph slowly, not for comprehension. She understood every word, but for confirmation that the long, meticulous effort hadn't been for nothing. The language, though formal, carried weight in its clarity. For once, there were no loopholes hiding in footnotes, no clauses open to interpretation. Her land was hers again, not symbolically, but legally, thoroughly, and undeniably. The pressure that had built so steadily over the past months cracked, and receded not with applause or grand declaration, but with that quiet, definitive certainty that it was over. Within days, the remaining signs and devices were gone. No crews arrived to retrieve them. They disappeared overnight, quietly, like the way they had come, as if someone had instructed all parties to retreat and erase evidence. The steel poles, the mounts, even the scorched remains of a buried cable segment near the culvert. Everything vanished. Emily didn't investigate who removed them. She didn't chase names or speculate about internal orders. The victory wasn't about retribution. It was about regaining ownership, not just of the land, but of her right to decide when and how to be left alone. The following week, a letter arrived. Not from a lawyer, nor from the council, but from the county registrar. It was an official notification stating that, based on the court's findings and the now public audit conducted by Perch, the zoning maps had been corrected to remove all references to shared use transitions on her parcel. A certified survey marker was scheduled for installation at the edge of her drive to reflect the boundaries publicly. Emily agreed to it, not because she needed more proof, but because markers mattered, especially when people tried so hard to move them. She didn't celebrate in the conventional sense. There were no gatherings, no press interviews. Her only response was to walk the full length of her property the morning after the markers were installed. She moved slowly, tracing the familiar edges, pausing now and then to look at the trees, the gravel, the undisturbed earth. There was no fanfare, only silence. But this time, the silence was clean. Not cautious, not waiting. Marissa stopped by that weekend, bringing coffee and 3 envelopes from other homeowners who had followed the case quietly from a distance. Inside each envelope was a handwritten note. No demands, no requests. Just thanks. One note read, "You drew a line and held it. That gave the rest of us the courage to check where ours really are." Emily placed the notes in the same file where she kept the court ruling and Perch's reports. Not as trophies, but as a reminder that what she had endured wasn't unique. It was just finally documented. Conrad called a few days later, not to discuss paperwork, but to inform her that the affidavit submitted by the anonymous whistleblower had triggered an internal audit of the development authority tied to the council. Several permits across the county had been revoked pending investigation. No one had been arrested, and likely no one would be. But the process was slowing. The machine that had tried to quietly rewrite ownership and erase resistance was now under scrutiny. And in a system built on momentum, even slowdowns mattered. Emily didn't ask for updates. She didn't need to follow the ripples. She had done what she set out to do. Not with confrontation, not with protest signs or shouting, but by knowing the system better than those who had tried to bend it. She had listened, documented, responded, and waited. Every form filled, every log entry made, every quiet meeting and precise rebuttal, it had all led to this. The moment where silence became protection, not threat. In the final days of October, as the air turned sharper and the pine trees shed their needles onto the gravel, Emily stood at the top of her driveway and looked down the path that had once been contested. There were no devices now. No signs, no strangers. Just the same curve, the same slope, the same stones she and her husband had first driven over more than a decade ago. She knew better than to believe the world had changed because of one ruling. But she also knew that lines drawn clearly and defended patiently could hold, even when no one believed they would. At the edge of her gate, mounted on a new post, was the only addition she'd made since the ruling. A steel plaque, cleanly engraved, simple in design. It read, "This land is under no agreement but my own. Enter accordingly." There was no need for anything else.